Before we begin, a heads up. This audio documentary shares personal stories and perspectives about alleged spiritual and sexual abuse. Some content is mature and may be graphic. Listener discretion is advised. If you feel overwhelmed while listening, please pause and seek support from a trusted friend or professional. Parents and guardians, please preview before sharing with minors.
When the leader of our community told me what had happened, I was just staring at the ceiling. I think I was in shock. So the whole conversation, I was just looking up at this spot in the ceiling, and my mind was just racing. I just thought, And then I thought of all these other times that I had thought, in my relationship with Father Dave. And it was like, it hadn't made sense before, but once I had this information, I realized, I need to rethink everything. I need to rethink my relationship with Father Dave. And the moment I shifted my perspective, it was really obvious to me that what had happened with this other sister was not a mistake. This wasn't just a, oops, I got carried away kind of moment. I knew that based on how he had interacted with me. I could see that it was calculated and it had been building. I didn't understand completely what grooming was, especially in the context of adults. But I did know that entering into a sexual relationship or trying to enter into a sexual relationship with someone under your spiritual care, under your spiritual direction. And not only that, you're a priest. It's not just inappropriate. It's not just boundary crossing. It's abusive. And knowing that, it just became clear to me in a moment. It was like a tidal wave that, if he was building towards that with me and this other sister, then he was building towards that with other people. That was just something I couldn't unsee.
Hi everyone, my name is Sister Danielle Victoria. A few years ago, Sister Theresa Aletheia and I did something brave, or something reckless, depending on who's listening. We both left the convent and began the long process of beginning a new religious community of nuns, or more technically accurate, religious sisters. We each had entered the convent more than a decade ago, but we felt God calling us to something else, to a new mission to people on the fringes of the church, especially those wounded, abused, or scandalized by members of the church. But for us, this mission wasn't abstract. It was personal. Just after we started our new community, Sister Theresa and I decided that before we began this mission, we needed to tell our own stories of abuse to protect anyone who could be harmed. In 2024, we came forward publicly to share our experiences of spiritual abuse at the hands of a trusted priest. This audio documentary delves more into our stories and the nuances and complexity of adult abuse in spiritual settings. For us, this abuse wasn't a headline. It marked a split in our lives, everything before and everything after. We both were raised Catholic but fell away from the church. Sister Theresa Aletheia became an atheist when she was 14, and I fell away from going to church in college. After we both had conversion experiences in our 20s, knowing Jesus and returning to the sacraments illuminated all the darkest corners of our lives. But entering the convent and encountering darkness inside the heart of the church shook the foundations of everything we thought we had found. Many of you listening might know something of what I'm talking about. Maybe you've lost trust. Maybe as a result, you've lost faith. Some of you carry unspeakable pain just beneath a smile. Maybe you still go to church and sit in the pews, but you're holding on by a thread. Or maybe after seeing too much, you've walked away. Whoever you are, all of us in one way or another have felt the ache of unbelonging. In this series, we ask, why is there so much darkness in a place that's supposed to bear the light? Why did I have to live this? Where does my own darkness belong? Sister Theresa Aletheia and I will take you with us back into the heart of the storm of spiritual abuse, into the grief, the disillusionment, and the hard, necessary questions. We'll begin at the first moment when our serene world cracked open and darkness came rushing in. But before we begin, we'll be upfront with you. There's no dramatic reveal ahead. In fact, here's the spoiler. Both Sister Theresa Aletheia and I experienced grooming, and in some cases, serious boundary violations by our spiritual director, Father Dave. Our own experiences came to light when another sister alleged that Father Dave sexually assaulted her. In 2024, all three of us told our story through The Pillar, an online Catholic journalism project committed to accountability in the Church. Sister Theresa and I told our stories publicly, and the sister who was assaulted told hers anonymously. So we already told our stories to protect others. This podcast is not about breaking our silence. It's about breaking things down, about understanding how this happened and how to prevent it from happening again. We love our faith and our church, and we also believe that we can do better. That's why we're telling our stories, in a spirit of repair, to illuminate how adult abuse happens in spiritual contexts and how it can be prevented. This audio documentary is the first major step in the mission of the Sisters of the Little Way of Beauty, Truth, and Goodness, a mission of listening in solidarity with people on the fringes of the Church, especially those who have been wounded, abused, or scandalized by members of the Church. To join us in our mission and to support future projects like this, please visit sistersofthelittleWay.com. As you listen, please take care of yourself. These are dark and painful places. If you're a survivor, we're not asking you to carry the burden of listening. But if you choose to, we hope you feel seen, affirmed, and less alone. If you're not a survivor, your presence matters deeply. And remember, this is not about creating sterile, inhuman environments. It's about being more human. It's about creating spaces of beauty, truth, and goodness where every person can flourish. In the end, this isn't just a podcast about abuse. It's a story about hope. Not the easy kind, but the kind forged in darkness. The kind that makes it possible to move forward in truth. Welcome to Descent into Light.
So I had questions about Father Dave, but really I wasn't thinking I shouldn't have him as my spiritual director. I was just wondering about certain things that he would do that made me feel uncomfortable. And that's when the leader of our community called me in and she said, Sister Theresa Aletheia, Father Dave can no longer be your spiritual director. And so I said, okay, why? And she said, the way she put it was odd now that I know what happened. I think she said something like Father Dave was in a compromising situation with another sister who was under his spiritual direction. And I would later find out that that description was a pretty mild description of what happened. But she told me Father Dave tried to kiss this sister. And I didn't really need more information to understand what was happening. You know, one moment I had a trusted and beloved spiritual director, and the next moment I didn't. And that's when I realized that that entire time that I thought that I was lucky to have Father Dave as my spiritual director, I was really in danger.
That's Sister Theresa Aletheia recalling a moment in 2017 when everything changed. Our religious community had just informed her that a priest we both deeply trusted wasn't who we thought he was. We weren't new to religious life. Sister Theresa had joined the convent in 2010, and I entered a few years later in 2013. We had given our lives to God and to the Church, but nothing had prepared us for this. That moment when trust shattered marked a point of no return. It didn't just change our community, it changed us. Realizing that someone we had looked up to was actually predatory forced us into a grief we hadn't expected to face. And the grief process often begins with shock. But this isn't just our story.
And our top story, the victims, the church, the silence. Who's to blame when both sides keep quiet about sexual abuse?
Every day there are more headlines about the Catholic hierarchy's dealing with the pedophilia and sexual abuse crisis in Boston and around the country.
Catholic Church's response to sexual abuse, or perhaps their lack of response.
There were hundreds in the Boston Archdiocese alone, and it's replicated in almost every diocese across the country and around the world.
If you're Catholic, you might remember the shock of the early 2000s when reports of children abused in the U.S. Catholic Church spread rapidly around the world through digital media. Or maybe in 2018, you heard about Cardinal Theodore McCarrick. He had advanced as a glowing star in the church despite rumors and reports of abuse.
We are seeing widespread reaction to the release of the McCarrick report.
Details about alleged sexual misconduct by a Catholic cardinal who was a power broker within the church.
Then it was revealed that he had been abusing both minors and seminarians for decades.
There were plenty of chances for the Catholic Church's leadership to stop this behavior. What happened to me was preventable had the right people done the right thing.
Or maybe you read the Pennsylvania grand jury report in the same year, and you still cannot forget how it turned your stomach.
What appears to be the largest abuse scandal to shake the American Catholic Church yet.
It alleges 300 Catholic priests sexually abused children for decades.
Several church administrators, including bishops, pressured victims and police to end or avoid investigations.
Every faith and religion has these stories. Every culture, country, and human community. No one is exempt. Whether or not you are a survivor of abuse in a church setting, a Christian, or anyone with an interest in religion, we all have experienced the shock of finding out about the darkness present within communities of faith. This podcast is about that grief, about what happens when faith meets betrayal and how we begin to heal. In this first episode, we dive into that initial rupture, the disorientation, the disbelief, the quiet, earth-shaking horror of discovering that someone you admired was dangerous all along. This is Descent into Light. Welcome to episode 1, Sacred Trust Shattered.
So after I was told what had happened, I walked out of that sister's office just kind of in a fog. I was numb for days, and my mind was racing, and I couldn't fully process what I was feeling, but something inside me had shifted. And during that time, I just replayed every interaction that I'd ever had with Father Dave in my head. Every conversation, every strange moment that had felt off. And it was like I had been trying to solve a puzzle, but I didn't have the piece. And the moment that I had that missing piece and I put it into place, it was like everything clicked. So when that last piece clicked into place, I just realized that wasn't innocent.
You may know what shock feels like. The moment someone you love dies. The moment someone you love betrays you. The moment you lose a relationship that feels like part of your identity. In these moments, you begin flipping through memories, adding them up and lingering on the happy ones, even as you realize in the span of a single breath how much you are losing. This is the moment grief often begins. We chose to format these episodes according to the stages of grief because we found that the only way forward in the aftermath of the darkness we experienced was to allow ourselves to grieve all that we had lost. In each episode of this series, we'll journey through the lens of a different stage of grief: shock, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, the upward turn, acceptance, and hope. The episodes in this series unfold in a certain order, but it's important to keep in mind that the stages are overlapping and intertwining. Grief is not linear. It has its own timeline, and it looks different for each person. Each stage can exist simultaneously and resurface in waves long after acceptance of a loss takes root. To help us understand the role of grief in a survivor's experience, we spoke with Regina Boyd, a licensed mental health counselor who has worked closely with survivors of clergy abuse. We asked her, what does shock look like in the wake of spiritual betrayal?
So the stages of grief, we'll start with shock as the first one. That is the initial disbelief of what has happened. So somebody who has a traumatic experience, either their abuser has crossed the line and now the veil has been lifted, the scales sort of fall from the eyes, and wow, this actually happened with somebody who I care about and who I trust. What's going on here? So I think a lot of questions and sense of unsafety, instability could be happening for that person in that stage. You have a person that you've come to know and trust, and your instincts at one point or another might have been saying, I feel like something's off. I can't really put my finger on it, but this just isn't feeling right. And yet I trust this person. I feel very close to them. And then come to find out that I actually had very good reason not to trust them. But now it's complicated because this is somebody who I do have a close personal relationship with. This isn't just a random act of violence or some random event. This is somebody who really plotted from the beginning. And I think a major impact of that can create a difficulty for people to trust other people. You have all of those common symptoms whenever something stressful happens: anxiety, depression, difficulty sleeping, things like that. But I think in general, relationship-wise, how do I re-engage? How do I know that I can trust myself? Because I was in this very confusing situation and this confusing relationship. Extremely hurtful and unnerving for somebody you're close to go to that level of malintent. It's beyond betrayal, almost. I mean, that is betrayal, but it feels beyond, like words aren't good enough to describe how impactful that is.
What's really hard to think about even now is that I really did have a lot of alarm bells going off in my relationship with Father Dave, and I just ignored them. And I wonder about that. I wonder why I did that. I look back to those moments and I think, well, how could I have missed that? I think it makes me feel stupid when I think about it. And I know I'm not stupid, but I think that's what grooming does. It just clouds your instincts. The first time I met Father Dave, it was after I'd made first vows, and it was during our annual retreat. So a lot of sisters were in our retreat house, and he wasn't my spiritual director that time, but I would just see him in the common areas. And I noticed whenever I was in the same room with him, he would look at me and not just glance at me. He would just stare at me. And I remember thinking, that feels weird. I felt uncomfortable. But he was really admired by all of our sisters. And he, whenever he would preach for the Mass, or even enter the room, we're all supposed to be silent, but there would be giggling around him all the time when he was in a room, because he was just really popular with our sisters. And so I just thought, when he'd so obviously stare at me, I just thought, I must be misinterpreting what's happening. Because on some level, I thought, is he attracted to me? But then I thought that couldn't be possible. So he wouldn't make it so obvious. So I just pushed that thought away. And at the end of the retreat, I went to him for confession. And when I went in, he kind of lit up and he squirmed in his chair. He just seemed really excited. And he asked me my name. And I said, my name is Sister Theresa. And he said, yeah, but don't you have a religious name? And I said, oh, yeah, Sister Theresa Aletheia. Aletheia is my religious name. And when I said it, I could tell he already knew the answer to that question. And he wasn't just asking out of curiosity. It was like he was setting me up for something. So he leaned in and he said, I'm going to tell you something that I've never told anyone before. And I would later realize that was something that he said a lot, like he was inviting you into a secret, that's something that was just between you and him. But I remember thinking, being flattered that he was going to tell me something that he'd never told anyone before. And he said, my guardian angel's name was revealed to me, and my guardian angel's name is Aletheia. And I had two reactions to that. Part of me was like, are you even supposed to ask what your guardian angel's name is? That seems weird. And another part of me wanted it to be meaningful. I think I was lonely in the convent, really. The conversations were often surface level. There was one time that I asked the sister how many siblings she had, and she told me that was an inappropriate question. That was a little bit extreme, but in general, it was a culture where it was hard to feel like you were known. And so when Father Dave showed interest in me and seemed to connect with me, I wanted it to feel meaningful. And so in that moment, when he said that to me, now I know. I don't think I knew in that moment, but I made a choice to believe him, to believe that it was meaningful and that we were meant to be holy friends. And I think that's when I decided to ask him if he wanted to be my spiritual director. So I asked a sister, do you think he would be my spiritual director? And she said, well, he's the spiritual director for a lot of our sisters. And he just became the Father General of his entire worldwide order. So he might not have time. And I just said, well, I'll try. And I reached out to him and he answered, with that same enthusiasm. And he said, absolutely. Yeah, and that's how Father Dave became my spiritual director.
We'll explain more in episode 2 what a spiritual director is, especially within Catholic religious life. But for now, we ask for your patience. We are introducing you to a subculture within a subculture. Even most Catholics have no idea what it's like to live in a convent or monastery. This is also true for women and men who join religious communities. They often have very little idea of what they are getting into. Even if they have visited and taken years to decide whether or not to enter, there's nothing like actually having the experience. So when Sister Theresa Aletheia and I joined the convent, it felt like entering a whole new world. Strange, beautiful, and at times shadowed by darkness. We'll walk you through that world as best we can, but in the meantime, if it seems strange, remember it was strange for us too. Now let's return to what Sister Theresa just shared. The warmth, the enthusiasm, the personal attention she described in Father Dave, that wasn't unusual. It was his signature. I can't count how many times I found myself thinking, he's too good to be true. He was so generous, so affirming, so seemingly selfless, and I wanted to believe it. When something felt off or he said something that seemed a little too personal or too familiar, I brushed it aside. I told myself, he's different. He's operating on some deeper spiritual level I can't quite understand. And slowly, without realizing it, I began to trust him more than I trusted my own instincts, more than I trusted myself, because he was a priest. That's what makes this story difficult. It isn't about obvious violence. It was subtle, quiet, the kind of violence that hides behind appearances that seem holy, both to you and to everyone around you. The kind of violence that confuses you into silence and makes you question your reality. But subtle does not mean harmless. What happens in the shadows can leave wounds just as deep as anything done in the light. This isn't the first time in the church that we've had to face such darkness hidden in the shadows. Dr. Julie Rubio explains why it's crucial to continue to address abuse in the church.
I'm Julie Halen Rubio. I am a professor of Christian social ethics and associate dean at the Jesuit School of Theology in Berkeley. My focus in ethics has long been on issues of sex, gender, and family. And I'm also the author with my colleague Paul Schutz at Santa Clara of an interdisciplinary study on clericalism called Beyond Bad Apples. And finally, I'm a member of the National Review Board. So the U.S. bishops created a lay board of advisors who help them implement their strategies to protect children and young people from sexual abuse. It's understandable that many Catholics, and certainly many in the Catholic hierarchy, don't want to talk about abuse anymore. It's uncomfortable. It has resulted in a huge financial crisis, and certainly is a part of why so many people are leaving the Catholic Church. So we would like to not talk about this anymore. But that's just not an option. It's not an option because survivors and those who were harmed by this crisis are still with us. Abuse is greatly reduced, but it's still happening. So there's still a lot of work to do, and we just can't afford to not talk about it.
As Dr. Rubio pointed out, addressing abuse is not optional. As Pope Leo XIV has said in regard to abuse, quote, "Prevention and care are not just pastoral strategies, they are the heart of the gospel," end quote. And as Pope Leo points out, abuse prevention is not a side issue. It's central to the gospel, and the next frontier of abuse prevention in the church is adult abuse. Like all abuse, this kind of harm is not simple. It has layers, and as we've tried to understand why adult abuse survivors are so often ignored, one thing has become clear. You cannot talk about adult abuse without talking about power. Too often in the church, we look at abuse through the wrong lens, asking about the vulnerability of the survivor. The weakness of this approach is that it denies the vulnerability we all possess, and it shifts the blame onto the survivor. But the truth is, the survivor is never at fault. I'm going to repeat that because it's important. The truth is, the survivor is never at fault. We'll explain more later why focusing on vulnerability is unhelpful, but for now, let's keep following the trail of power. You might think, well, if two people are adults, then the power between them must be equal. But that's simply not true. Power creates different dynamics in very obvious ways in society. Wealth can be a factor, gender, race. Within church settings, all these things are factors, along with other spiritual factors. So let's examine the power at play for Father Dave. Father Dave was a priest, and priests in general are given a certain deference and respect in Catholic culture. But this is especially true among religious sisters. Father Dave was also a religious priest. In the Catholic Church, there are religious priests and diocesan priests. We won't get into the weeds of how they differ, but suffice it to say that religious priests, like religious sisters, live in community. They have their own specific mission within the Church, and they take the same vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. So religious sisters often feel an affinity and greater understanding with priests who also live in religious communities. So Father Dave was not only a priest, he was a religious priest, and then on top of that, he had just been elected to the most important role in his worldwide community as what they call Father General. For all of these reasons, Father Dave held a lot of power within his own community, and that power translated to the kind of access and power he had in our own community of sisters.
So when I first met Father Dave, he had just become Father General of his whole order, his whole community all over the world. And he told me this story about meeting Pope Francis, and he pulled out his phone and showed me a picture of him shaking hands with Pope Francis. And he said when he first met Pope Francis and shook his hand, Pope Francis leaned in and whispered something in his ear. And when he told me that story, he pulled me close and whispered in my ear. And I remember thinking, it gave me the chills when he did it. And it was in a whole group of people. So I remember thinking, this must be normal. He just seemed to have a lot of power in our community. And after he became Father General, it seemed like he had more power. He was asked to join our board. He led a retreat for all of our sisters in leadership. He just seemed always around. Even though he was Father General and he was in Italy, he was often at our retreats and often around. And so whenever I had doubts about his behavior, I would think about that picture of him shaking hands with Pope Francis, and I would think his entire community all over the world thought that he would be the best leader for them. And all of my sisters trust this man. So why wouldn't I trust him? Something must be wrong with me if I don't trust him. And Father Dave wasn't just powerful, he was very charismatic. He would enter a room and the whole room would light up, and people would lean in to listen to him. They would laugh at his jokes. They would praise how insightful he was. And the sisters really delighted in him. It just seemed obvious that they loved him and thought he was wonderful. I mean, there was probably some sisters who didn't feel that way, but they were definitely the minority. So for the most part, I think our entire community felt the same way I did about Father Dave. Like, we were lucky because he loved us and we were chosen by him. And I can understand why we all felt special with Father Dave. He knew all of us. He was friends with all of the sisters in leadership. He was a spiritual director for many of the younger sisters. He had just built a lot of trust in the community over time, and no one seemed to question it. Well, I mean, what I now realize is that anyone who has that degree of power in a community is, even if they have good intentions, it's a dangerous situation.
A lot of people talk about clericalism. And that was part of why we wanted to study it. But we worried that many people by clericalism mean priests who sort of lord their power over you and disrespect you. Certainly there are those priests, but that is not what we're talking about. We understand clericalism to be a structure of power that isolates clergy and sets them above and apart from lay people, granting them excessive authority, trust, rights, and responsibilities. So not a vice, but a structure. So even if I, as a priest, do not want this power, do not want to be isolated above and apart, I get these advantages. Even if I, as a layperson, don't want to grant that kind of power to a priest, I can be influenced by this structure. So anyone can participate in, cooperate with a structure of clericalism, and anyone can resist it. To say something as a structure doesn't mean that there is that it acts upon us and we have no agency. Always, we also have agency. But it does mean that there are structures that are real, even though they're invisible, that incentivize or push us in one direction or the other, despite our best intentions. As a professor, no one tells me that I need to stand at the front of the room and give grades, but these are just part of the role of being professor. And my students come with all kinds of expectations about what it means to be a student and what it means to be a professor. So when I try to give them more agency, to decrease my own power in some ways, that's actually difficult because of this invisible structure that tells us we have certain roles. So that's what I mean by structure. It's there, it's real, it has power, and yet we also can recognize it and use our agency to do something else.
The sacred trust that many people give to clergy and others in leadership in the church comes with a grave responsibility to care for the freedom and dignity of the other. When this trust is violated, it damages a person's faith in the church and in God. If we want to restore or repair this sacred trust, we need to first understand how it has been violated. For this, a clear understanding of consent is absolutely foundational to understanding why adult abuse, particularly in spiritual settings, is so often misunderstood, overlooked, or even excused. One thing is unmistakably clear. Abuse hinges on consent, and consent is never as simple as the absence of a no, especially not when a powerful authority figure like a priest, pastor, or spiritual leader is involved. In cases of clergy abuse involving adults in all Christian faiths, the argument often goes something like this: but they were both adults. It was consensual. This logic is devastatingly common and deeply flawed. It assumes that age alone determines whether someone can freely choose to engage in a sexual relationship. It erases the profound influence that power, trust, and spiritual authority exert on a person's ability to say yes, or to even know they can say no. What gets missed is the emotional and psychological grooming that often precedes any sexual contact. It doesn't begin in the bedroom. It begins in a place of trust, of vulnerability, of admiration. Grooming can look like kindness and generosity. It can sound like spiritual wisdom. It can feel like attention that you've been craving in a lonely environment, like someone finally sees you. It often happens slowly, deliberately, over weeks or months, even years. The perpetrator doesn't start with boundary-crossing behaviors. They start by making you feel chosen, special, known. And then, without you realizing it, the lines begin to blur. The person under someone's spiritual care may start questioning their instincts. Maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe I'm misinterpreting this person's interest. He's a priest. He's holy. Or this person is my superior, a holy leader. This must be good, right? And when the abuse happens, often framed in spiritual or emotional language, the victim may not even recognize it as abuse at first. The confusion, shame, and misplaced sense of responsibility can be overwhelming. And that's by design. This is why power dynamics matter so deeply. Because when someone holds spiritual, emotional, or institutional authority over you, when they are responsible for your formation, your well-being, your soul, the idea of consent becomes murky. You're not operating on level ground, and yet so many survivors in these situations are still blamed. They're told they should have known better, that they participated willingly, that they seduced or misinterpreted. The predator is often protected and the victim discredited. Currently, only 13 states and the District of Columbia have penal statutes that in at least some circumstances support the criminal prosecution of clergy persons engaged in sexual misconduct with people under their spiritual care. States like Minnesota and Texas have prosecuted priests for this kind of abuse. These laws are slowly shifting public understanding, but most victims of adult abuse in these kinds of situations are still left without legal recourse. The thing that people need to understand is that adults can be groomed, adults can be abused, and when spiritual power is involved, the harm is not just emotional or physical, it's soul deep. Until we understand this, we will continue to ask the wrong questions. We will continue to protect those who engage in this kind of abuse, and we will continue to scrutinize the survivor rather than examine how power was leveraged and misused in a situation. And by doing this, we will continue to betray the very people we are called to protect. That's why we're telling the story, because what happened to us and to many others did not look like violence. It didn't involve force or threats, but it was abuse all the same. Subtle, hidden, devastating. Adult abuse needs to be seen for what it is, and it needs to be talked about. Taking those 2 steps of understanding power and consent would make a huge difference in preventing abuse from happening to others. Our mission as Sisters of the Little Way is a call to the church to listen and to stand in solidarity with those on the fringes of the church, especially those who have been wounded, abused, or scandalized by her own members. But this mission doesn't belong to us alone. It belongs to anyone who refuses to look away. Will you be one of them? Join us at sistersofthelittleWay.com.
So, entering into religious life and the convent is like going into a different culture. The whole way it's set up is that when you enter into it, you're relying on everyone around you to help you navigate something that is very new and very different. So I felt, when I entered, I entered the convent because I wanted to make a radical decision. I wanted to radically give my life to Jesus. And that radicality made me very open to everything that I was going to be taught, everything that anyone wanted to tell me about what this life was about. When I entered the convent, it didn't occur to me that the culture of the convent would, there might be aspects of it that were not from God and not gospel-centered. I just assumed it was a convent. I assumed that I could be open to everything. And I just assumed that everyone around me knew more than I did about this life, which obviously on some level that's true. They do. They've lived it, and they're there to teach you how to live it. So you enter the convent completely reliant on everyone around you to help you to navigate this foreign culture and understand what you're supposed to do in it. And I think anyone in that kind of situation, no matter how assertive they are, how intelligent they are, how clear-headed they are, how likely they are to ask questions, I think any person who enters into religious life and into that kind of a community is in a vulnerable situation. A lot of people talk about vulnerable adults or how can we protect vulnerable adults in the church. And I really don't think that's the right phrase, because it's not about certain qualities of the person that make them vulnerable. I was vulnerable because I was in a vulnerable situation.
So while it's tempting to blame bad apples for the problem of clergy sexual abuse, this explanation is not supported by the data. We can look at, there's certainly some priests have psychological profiles that we would clearly connect with abuse, but many others do not. So while psychological explanations can get us so far, they cannot explain the vast majority of abuse. It's similar, really, when we think about sexual violence more generally. A typical man and it is mostly men, this is important to our study as well, who abuses does not have a definable profile. Rather, ordinary men engage in sexual abuse. So researchers in sexual violence were already telling us we need to look more broadly. It's not just bad guys, it's our sons and our fathers and our husbands, right? Our stepfathers, our friends who engage in this abuse. They're not all severely impaired psychologically. They weren't all abused as children. This is a broader structural problem.
It's often difficult for people to grasp that adults can be abused. Abuse doesn't require bruises or screaming or physical force. It can happen quietly, invisibly, and devastatingly. Adult abuse happens when someone holds power, spiritual, emotional, institutional, and uses that power to manipulate, confuse, and ultimately control another person. And in religious settings, that power is often immense. Spiritual authority can be one of the most potent forms of influence. It's a mistake to think this kind of abuse only happens to the naive, the weak, or the wounded, or the inexperienced. In fact, the opposite is often true. People who abuse don't usually pursue the disengaged. They pursue the faithful, the devoted, the ones who want to serve, who trust deeply, and who are willing to sacrifice for something greater than themselves. Because that devotion, that sincerity, it can be manipulated. It becomes the perfect entry point for someone seeking control. And for religious sisters, there is perhaps no time of greater spiritual openness than the annual retreat. It's 8 days set apart from everything. No phones, no distractions, no noise. Just silence, solitude, and prayer. It's the spiritual high point of the year, a sacred invitation to grow closer to God. Each day centers on the Eucharist. And in the community we were a part of, every sister had the opportunity to meet one-on-one with a priest for spiritual direction. These conversations were meant to nourish the soul, to gently guide, to encourage, to offer wisdom and support. It's holy ground, which is what makes it so unspeakably painful when that ground is defiled.
Father Dave directed 2 of my annual silent retreats, which last for 8 days. The first retreat, both retreats, looking back, I can see things that he did that were odd. But the first retreat, it was interesting because he set up the prayer periods in a very overly romantic way. I mean, one time he told me to envision a bed. He would kind of set different scenes that I would enter into. It was always an Ignatian-style prayer where you're in the scene with Jesus and you imagine yourself bodily in a scene and the scene plays out. Except he often left out the scripture part. He would just kind of encourage me to use my imagination and imagine a scene with Jesus. And the way that he introduced praying with these kinds of encounters, now looking back, it was very interesting. He gave me several examples. One of them involved a religious sister who came back from her prayer period, and Father Dave said that she was really bashful, and he would kind of imitate her, blinking her eyes bashfully, and she said that Jesus kissed her on the mouth. So he gave me that example. Another example he gave me was of a woman who came back from her prayer, and she told Father Dave that she had been sitting with Jesus, and Jesus had his head in her lap, and then Jesus had kissed her there. He didn't say what there meant, but when he said it, he crossed his legs and kind of giggled. I was shocked by these stories, but I just would chalk it up to my own kind of distaste for that kind of imagery or romantic ideas around my relationship with Jesus. Obviously, now looking back, I realize it was a lot more sinister.
When Sister Theresa Aletheia describes moments with Father Dave that felt uncomfortable, both in private and in public, that's something we often see in cases of predatory behavior. Inappropriate boundary crossing doesn't just happen in private. It can sometimes happen in full view of others. The problem is when people are disturbed but remain silent. Because here's the truth that's often hardest to grasp. When adults are abused, it's not just one person being manipulated. It's entire communities. Just like with child abuse, grooming doesn't happen in isolation. Abusers don't only groom their victims, they groom the people around them. They gain trust, admiration, and authority. They become spiritual guides, mentors, holy figures, and in doing so, they secure access, not just to one person, but to the entire ecosystem that surrounds them. So, if after an abuse occurs, we refuse to examine how that person leveraged power, how they groomed not just one person, but an entire community, we leave ourselves wide open to harm again. When a community fails to see this, abuse doesn't just repeat, it becomes predictable. You'll hear us come back to this point again and again in this podcast, because while our story involves an alleged sexual assault, the series is not ultimately about one incident or one scandal. It's about the conditions that make abuse possible and invisible. It's about raising awareness so people and communities can recognize red flags before it's too late. It's about beginning the hard, necessary work of repair and healing after rupture. So while Sister Theresa Aletheia and I experienced grooming and in some cases serious boundary violations by our spiritual director, Father Dave, that's not the focus of this podcast. The focus is the context, the subtle, quiet, often invisible forces that made it all possible. In fact, we chose to tell our story not because it's the most dramatic, but because it is subtle. And subtlety is what makes these stories dangerous. When the harm doesn't look obvious, it's easier to ignore, easier to excuse, and easier to let happen again. We chose to speak up again despite knowing the scrutiny that comes with that because subtle stories need to be told too. If we're serious about preventing abuse, then we need to get better at recognizing it before it turns into a headline. That means paying attention, not just to the abuse that happened, but to the cultural dynamics that allowed that abuse to happen in the first place. The silence, the deference, the misplaced trust in titles, the belief that apparent holiness and charisma can't coexist with manipulation and harm. Because once we learn to spot the grooming, the behavior, the patterns, the systems, we can start making our communities safer and truly understand what is needed to heal and repair. And that is what this podcast is really about.
The last 8-day retreat that Father Dave was my spiritual director, I just started to have more questions about his behavior. And I remember they kind of rose a little bit more to the surface during that time. One time he came into chapel and he kissed the altar and then he said, "Oh, the voice of virgins singing, you just can't know what that does for a man." I remember the whole chapel kind of burst into nervous giggles. And I was just shocked. And I looked around, but no one would meet my eyes to kind of confirm that that was incredibly inappropriate and strange. Then the first time he met with the whole group of sisters that he was going to be directing for the retreat. And I remember looking around the group and noticing that almost all of them were the youngest sisters in the community. And I remember thinking, that's interesting. And then as the meeting was ending, everyone was signing up for their slot in the day when they would talk to Father Dave. And I was the last one to sign up, so I got the last slot of the day. And everyone had left at this point, and he said to me, "I'm so glad that you signed up for that last slot." And I said, "Oh, really? Why?" And he said, "Because we can talk all through dinner, and we can talk as long as we want." And, I knew that 2 other sisters in that group had just lost parents. Like they were in great need of his, guidance and direction during this time. And I remember thinking, that's an odd thing to say to me. And so I just walk away from these situations and think, Then at the end of the retreat, he did something that made me really uncomfortable. I saw him in the direction room, and I entered to say goodbye to him, and he pulled me towards him, and he kissed my face. I think he kissed my forehead. I don't even remember where because I was so shocked. And he said goodbye. I remember kind of stumbling out of the room thinking, that was strange. That was inappropriate. I don't know what is happening here. And it was only a couple weeks after this retreat that the provincial called me into her office and told me that Father Dave could no longer be my spiritual director. I think once my provincial told me that piece of crucial information, once that lens shifted, it was like all of those moments, all of those strange things that had happened that I had overlooked and chosen to ignore, they were like dead bodies in a lake that just popped up the moment I had the right information. But now I knew that this was predatory behavior.
Around the same time that Sister Theresa Aletheia found out that Father Dave was in a so-called compromising situation with another sister, I got a phone call. It was another sister. Her voice was tense. She told me the same thing that Sister Theresa had been told, that Father Dave had been found in a compromising situation with a sister. That was all she said. No details, just those two words, compromising situation. At the time, I didn't know what was meant by those words. It sounded serious, but it also sounded mutual in some way. I wasn't sure what to make of that phrase, but it touched on a deeper intuition I had and that I hadn't been able to name before that moment. I had known Father Dave much longer than Sister Theresa. He was more than just my spiritual director. He had helped me discern my vocation. He introduced me to the community I now called home. He was, in many ways, a father figure. My trust in him ran deep. So when I heard those words, compromising situation, it felt like the ground beneath me shifted. Suddenly, I was forced to question everything. How many of my life choices had been shaped by the influence of someone I now wasn't sure I could trust? In a single breath, a wave of realization hit me, and I asked a question that brought to the surface an instinct that I had been ignoring. I asked, was the situation predatory? I had no idea why I asked that in the moment, but now I know I had an unconscious intuition that something was off. The sister I was talking to indicated that it might have been, and then she added one more thing before we hung up. She asked me not to talk about it, not to bring it up, to keep it to myself. I had just made my first vows: poverty, chastity, and obedience. I wanted nothing more than to be faithful. I wanted to be good. I believed that being obedient was what holiness looked like. So I did what I was asked. I held my breath, and as I dove into the deep waters, I swallowed this dark secret. This audio documentary is the first step in the mission of the Sisters of the Little Way of Beauty, Truth, and Goodness, a mission of listening and solidarity with people on the fringes of the church, especially those who have been wounded, abused, or scandalized by members of the church. If you would like to support our mission and projects like this, please visit sistersofthelittleway.com.
There is cancer in my bones from the poison I've accepted. There is blood on my hands from the work they have neglected. And this hole beside my heart, this is love rejected. These weakened muscles, this is my body.